I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Larry Mohn. I'm president of the Manhattan Institute, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning to discuss and celebrate the legacy of Walter Wriston. Before Bill Rhodes and the panelists today talk about Walter's impact on the banking and business worlds, I would just like to take a moment to mention the impact that Walter had on the Manhattan Institute. During Walter Wriston's nearly 20 years on the Manhattan Institute board, he was an inexhaustible source of ideas. His intelligence, his wit, and good humor brightened every board meeting. In addition to being a trustee, Walter was akin to an unpaid senior fellow. While on the Institute's board, he wrote two brilliant books, Risk and Other Four-Letter Words and The Twilight of Sovereignty, and penned numerous op-eds for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the other prestigious publications in the city. He was by far a first-rate intellectual. Even in the last year of his life, as he battled a very aggressive form of cancer, Walter did not stop contributing. He finished work on a final book, Bits, Bytes, and Balance Sheets, that was published posthumously by Hoover Press and it's outside. He continued to attend the Institute's board meetings, and just weeks before he died, he wrote a wonderful op-ed for the Wall Street Journal titled, What About Insourcing?, that reminded all those who worry about globalization that more jobs are created than lost when economies open and trade expands. I think the legacy of Walter Wriston was best summed up by his good friend Henry Kissinger, who called Walter the type of American who made this country the hope of the world. Here this morning, to kick off our discussion of Walter Wriston's impact on the banking and business worlds, is William Rhodes. Bill Rhodes joined Citibank in 1957 after graduating from Brown University and rose through the ranks to ultimately become chairman, president, and chief executive officer of Citibank and Citigroup. Today, he serves as Citi's senior international officer and is a member of Citi's operating and management committees. Bill Rhodes gained a reputation for international financial diplomacy in the 1980s and 90s because of his leadership in helping to manage the external debt crises that involved developing nations and their creditors worldwide. During that period, he headed the advisory committees of international banks that negotiated debt restructuring agreements for Argentina, Brazil, Jamaica, Korea, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. Bill has received numerous awards for his contributions to international banking and finance, and he sits on the boards of a number of corporations and nonprofits, including ConocoPhillips, the Private Export Funding Corporation, the U.S. Korea Business Council, and the Institute of International Finance. He also serves as chairman of the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, and he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Group of 30. In 2005, Bill received an honorary doctorate in humane letters from his alma mater, Brown University, and last year, Brown established the William R. Rhodes Center for International Economics at the Wriston Institute for International Studies. Please join me in welcoming William Rhodes.
Very much. Walt was always great on short introductions, but it's great to see so many friends of Walter in the audience. In particular, he would be very pleased to see how many former Citibankers are here. And there are a number of present Citibankers, but a lot of former ones. And as I said, he would be very pleased. And I want to thank the Manhattan Institute for holding this session, this forum on the legacy of Walter. Those of us who worked with him over the years saw him as a leader of vision and courage and a man of extraordinary kindness and dignity. He had a deep commitment here to the Manhattan Institute right to the day he passed away, and he always talked about the Manhattan Institute. And I want to thank the Institute again for giving me this opportunity to say a few words about him. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to work with him through many, many years. And I think those of us who knew him had this great appreciation for him. Walt spent nearly 4 decades at the service of Citibank, during which he had a major impact on the development of both the U.S. and international banking system. Among the key innovations Citibank introduced under his leadership were the first certificate of deposit, credit cards, and automated teller machines. He also helped to expand access to information technology worldwide. His emphasis on technological innovations, even though oftentimes not well received at the time they were made, helped make Citibank one of the world's largest and most successful banks and shape today's modern banking system worldwide. Walt was born in Middletown, Connecticut, to a mother who was a chemistry teacher and a father, Henry Merritt Wriston, a history professor at Wesleyan University. And his father later became president of Lawrence College and then of my alma mater, Brown University. In his youth, Walt was an Eagle Scout and graduated with a BA degree from Wesleyan in 1941. He received his master's from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts in 1942. Following graduate school, Walt worked for 1 year in the Foreign Service and then enlisted in the U.S. Army in the Signal Corps, where he rose to the rank of lieutenant. He married his first wife, Barbara Brengel Wriston, in 1942, with whom he had one daughter, Catherine. After Barbara's death in 1966, he married his beloved Kathy Deneen, who is here with us today. In 1946, Walt joined Citibank as a junior inspector in the Controllers Division and embarked on a highly successful career. Between that position and his appointment as chairman in 1970, he distinguished himself in numerous domestic and international assignments. But Walt was not just about Citibank. He believed in public-private partnerships and giving back to the community where the bank operated around the world. In line with this view, he played a key role in the resolution of New York's financial crisis in the 1970s. He was also involved in the political and economic policy-making arena as chairman of President Ronald Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board and a member and then chairman of the Business Council, and also a chairman and a member of the Business Roundtable. Outside of his career with Citibank, he was a director of numerous companies, including for many years a director of GE, where he was the lead director. I think next to the founder of GE, he spent the longest time of any director in the history of General Electric. Walter was awarded honorary doctorate degrees by at least 12 colleges and universities and received many other awards in recognition of his lifetime achievements. He was a steadfast advocate of free market principles, and in 2004, President Bush bestowed on him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Walt was a prolific writer and speaker about the changes that technology was making in the world's financial marketplace. We are fortunate that his papers, including text from hundreds of speeches, are now archived at Tufts University and cover a wide range of subjects, including international banking and finance, information technology, economics, and politics, and we'll be hearing more of that from Ambassador Bosworth when he speaks. Walt helped reshape the financial marketplace in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s. He was a banker of his generation who most impacted and influenced the world's financial system, as well as a great internationalist and always a proponent of free and open trade. Walt was also a change agent in the area of banking and international finance. He was a major force in helping promote the information revolution in financial services. By pioneering innovation and technology, he was a visionary and ahead of his time. He recognized the potential of the growth of consumer banking not only in the U.S., but also worldwide, and was an early champion of the Internet and saw the important role the Internet would play in financial services. He also understood very early on the importance of the emerging markets and the opportunities that would take shape there, and committed Citibank to a path of overseas expansion and globalization. Those of us at Citibank know very well that Walt always fought for bank deregulation, greater competition in the banking industry, and pushed for nationwide banking. He firmly believed that regulation really starts at home. He understood the importance of risk management as a first line of defense and the need for a bank to regulate itself through high standards, effective systems, and discipline. He was an excellent developer and motivator and mentor of people and always supported them 100%. I remember when I was spearheading the emerging markets debt restructuring in the 1980s and early 90s, Walt always gave me support, even in the most difficult moment when nobody else was around. And he always told me, he says, you know, Bill, you're not in this alone. If something goes wrong, I'm there with you. That doesn't happen very often, that's for sure. He was a great leader and built the esprit de corps of Citibank, which made it the world's preeminent financial institution of its time. Employees globally were proud to say, I'm a Citibanker. He also spoke about the changes that technology was making in the world. He believed that the basis of wealth had evolved from land to labor to information. In his book, Twilight of Sovereignty, Walt made the point that the ratio of intellectual capital to physical material would continue to favor intellectual capital, and saw human intelligence and intellectual resources as the world's prime capital. He saw the impact that the marriage of satellites, television, faxes, cellular phones, and worldwide computer networks had and would continue to have in transforming our world. He also believed that the world financial marketplace was not constrained by national boundaries. A famous quote from Walt is, no matter what political leaders do or say, the screens will continue to light up. Traders trade, currency values will continue to be set, not by sovereign governments, but by global plebiscite. We see an extension of this thinking in his final book, Bits, Bytes, and Balance Sheets, where he continued to explore the implication of the information revolution on business and addressed, among other things, balance sheet disclosures and the importance of that, which is obviously a current subject of discussion in Wall Street. Walt is a legend, and his legacy has left a lasting mark on the financial services industry. Many institutions and countless individuals whom his life touched will remain, I think, something very, very important. His legacy will remain with us for a long, long time. We brought along, and I think there are copies for everyone, a DVD that Citi put together at the time of Walt's receipt of the Medal of Freedom, which says something about his life. So I hope all of you can get a copy of that. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Greetings. I'm Steve Malanga, senior editor at Citi Journal, and I'm going to moderate the panel today. You'll notice we have two speakers. Some of you may have been expecting also to see Larry Kudlow. Larry had to cancel at the last moment because of what we understand is a tennis injury. It's nothing serious, although I understand he's on a plane to the West Coast to consult with Tiger Woods' orthopedic surgeon right now. But Larry assures us that he will be back on the court for Wimbledon. We're here to discuss Walt Wriston's legacy in a host of areas, from his impact internationally to his business leadership right here in the United States. But if there's one underlying notion that Wriston himself believed unified his endeavors and was crucial to his own success in life as well as to our continued prosperity as a nation, it is that free markets and democracy are essential. Walt was especially worried that as a society, our faith that government could and should somehow protect us from ourselves was rising. More than 20 years ago, he sounded an alarm that could have been written last week or even today, when he observed in a foreword to a collection of his essays that, quote, the Salvation Army was founded by an extraordinary person who asked the question, why should the devil have all the good songs? These essays were written following a similar theory. Why should the advocates of bigger government and more regulation, which lead inevitably to a loss of individual freedom, be lightly opposed in the battle of ideas? During much of the period during which these speeches were written, the proponents of free markets, with some notable exceptions, were not much in evidence. This was particularly true in the financial services industry. As I said, it could have been written today. Among Wriston's achievements was to turn what was then First National City into a global powerhouse, in the process becoming himself one of the world's most important bankers. We're honored to have Dean Stephen Bosworth, from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, here to discuss Walt's international legacy.
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure and an honor to be here to talk about the man who, without question, was the Fletcher School's most illustrious and accomplished graduate in the 75 years of its history. In preparing for today, I went back and looked through some of the Fletcher School archives. It was mentioned earlier that Walt graduated from the Fletcher School in 1942. The school then had a one-year master's program, which was the standard fare for everyone. It's now a little more varied, but that remains sort of the cornerstone of the school. Walt didn't seem to get around to applying for admission to the Fletcher School until May of 1941. And not surprisingly, by the time the school received his application, they had already reached their upper limit of students who would be admitted, which in those years was fixed at 50, which I must say must have made for a somewhat easier job and task for the dean of the school in those years. Walt, however, persisted and sent in his application anyway. And in response, the dean, Mr. Hoskins, in I think a flash of inspiration, decided to take a flyer. And fortunately, one of the 50 had postponed or deferred their admission for a year, and so there was that last slot available. So the dean replied to Walt's letter and application by saying, if you can produce the rest of your application in short order and send me, of course, a photo, then we will expect you here in August to start the program. Walt replied that he would, of course, send his completed application forthwith, but unfortunately he did not have a photo. And I couldn't help but think that that was certainly not a condition in which he would have found himself later in life, as the Citibank apparatus produced lots of photos whenever one was needed, and in fact produced a DVD on Walt. I came to know Walt as a person in the last 2 or 3 years of his life after I had come back from Korea. And Walt and Kathy were then considering a major gift to the Fletcher School, which ultimately occurred, in which Walt endowed the Walter Wriston Chair of International Finance at the school, which is a very important gift from our perspective, and one in which Walt obviously took a certain degree of satisfaction. However, this process involved a number of lunches that I was able to have with Walt, and each one of those was like an extended seminar. I was absolutely fascinated by this man. And our backgrounds, while quite different in terms of the things that we were doing, were not all that different in terms of interests and where we had done them. So we had extended discussions of the nature of globalization, what it meant to be an American diplomat, or indeed what it meant to be an American banker. He was a man who I found he was an elegant man with an elegant mind and the source of fascination. He never stopped questioning. He never stopped nor lost confidence in the future. That didn't mean, however, that he was not without question and without some degree of skepticism, never cynicism, but some degree of skepticism about the condition of the human condition and what man would wrought on this earth. He had tremendous imagination. Anyone who has read any of his writings will find that this comes through very directly. He was a man who, I think above all, prized integrity. And I think any of you in this room who knew him and who worked with him would be very much in agreement with that statement. I never really met anyone for whom the word integrity was so fitting. It absolutely defined the man. He had, as was suggested, great faith in free markets and democracy. and great faith in science. But his faith in those things was not unquestioning. He was, at least in my experience, concerned about the degree to which free markets produced what he was very willing to call corporate excess, and raised the question as to who would watch the watchers, in effect. He also had great faith in democracy, but recognized that democracy is only as good as the people demand that it be, and only as good as the leaders that democracy produced. So there were times when he would express a certain degree of concern about the condition of the American democratic experience, but never to the point of saying we should try something else, and never to the point of being willing to substitute the judgment of government for the judgment of the free market. I've been asked to speak a little bit about Walt and the international dimension of him and his work. We at the Fletcher School like to think that at least we had some small degree of influence over shaping Walt's international perspective. That is, after all, what we pride ourselves on trying to do. I suspect that our contribution to Walt's orientation was not insignificant, but not major either. This was a man who came to the Fletcher School, who went through World War II, the period after World War II. He joined briefly the diplomatic service. He came to City, I think, as a confirmed internationalist, as someone who saw the possibilities of an international life and of international work. He left a tremendous legacy all around the world, and this is where I first encountered the legacy of Walt Wriston when I was posted in places in Latin America and in East Asia, particularly, I would say, in East Asia, where someone once observed all of the marketing people in East Asia were trained by Procter & Gamble, and all of the bankers and financial types were trained by the Citibank. And I think there is really something to be said about that. I have not actually done the quantitative analysis, but I suspect if someone went through the rosters of major bankers around the world, in the private sector and then major people in ministries of finance and central banks, one would be overwhelmed by the inordinate number of ex-Citi bankers that one found. I know that was true in the Philippines, it was true in South Korea, it's been true in every Asian country with which I've had any association. Something about the bank at that point tapped the very best, not only in the United States and among Americans who went on to have great careers in the bank, but tapped the very best in the rest of the world, people who were committed to seeing banking and private commerce lead countries out of poverty, lead countries into success and into prosperity. And despite the ups and downs of international markets and the international economy, I think that faith has been certainly well justified. And if you look around East Asia now, again, you will be struck by the number of central bankers, ministers of finance, CEOs of major financial institutions whose roots lie in Citibank and whose orientation and thinking and philosophy were inordinately shaped by one individual who left his mark on that bank and thereby left his mark on a whole generation of people who were committed to trying to bring about the economic improvement for people around the world, people whose lives rose at that point through the marvels of the marketplace and the marvels of good governance. We had a ceremony that was sponsored by the bank when Walt's gift was announced and formally made to us for this chair of international finance. And I don't know how many of you have been through academic ceremonies. They tend not to be the most stimulating thing in the world. Walt was, of course, I think, pleased that this was happening. Certainly he was pleased that he had had the opportunity to make this gift and that he and Kathy could go forward in this direction. But as sometimes happens, the ceremony itself, and some of you here may have even been there, The ceremony itself was unbelievably long. Without naming names, one of the members of the Fletcher faculty who was particularly benefiting from the establishment of this chair in international finance seized this opportunity to deliver the very essence of everything he knew and believed in. That essence consumed 2 hours and 10 minutes of lecture. I had the misfortune of sitting up on the stage and watching the audience as it kind of visibly collapsed and disintegrated. And I finally, in something that was not easy to do, I finally got up and tapped the lecturer on the shoulder and suggested that we had to move on. Lunch was awaiting. Anyway, at the end of that ceremony, we all went to lunch at the bank, and Walt made some very, very touching and appropriate remarks, at the end of which he said, "You know, if I had known that this was going to be such a big deal, I probably wouldn't have done it." Anyway, this is a man for whom I have had tremendous admiration for Kathy, for what they together did, for Walt's contribution to the United States, to our banking industry, but more than that, his contribution to people, his commitment to people. I think by far the greatest legacy that Walt left is not a gift here and there to an educational institution, important though those are, but the people that he left behind, people who had been touched and inspired by working with him, by observing him, by being witness to his intellect, to his imagination, and perhaps most of all, to his integrity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Bosworth. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think of Walt Wriston as a devotee of science fiction, but actually in his book, The Twilight of Sovereignty, he told a story of an intergalactic consulting company imagined by the science fiction writer Paul Anderson. The company, called Serendipity, Inc., sells just one thing: information about potential opportunities in distant solar systems. So exclusive is this information that if you, as a CEO, ask the company for advice on a potential opportunity, Serendipity would automatically advise you against it on the notion that if you know enough to ask the question, the opportunity is already gone. Now, what attracted Wriston to this idea is that it described a future when information is the most valuable of all resources. Today, of course, we accept that as the present. But writing in the early 1990s, Walt boldly declared that the time had already arrived when information had replaced tangible assets as our chief resource. Now, as someone who, as a journalist, was writing endlessly about the information superhighway in the 1990s and not believing a bit of it, I can tell you what a leap this really was for someone at this time. It's hard for us to bring ourselves back to that particular time. But Walt clearly not only saw it in the early 90s, but by his business actions actually sensed it decades ago. George Gilder, whose many achievements range from writing groundbreaking works on poverty to delineating the particular genius of the Silicon Revolution, is here to talk about the role Wriston played in helping create that new information-driven world. George?
Thank you. Well, Walter Wriston was the pivotal force in the creation of the leading financial institution in the leading financial center in the world, and in pushing the influence of that institution to embrace the entire globe and to inspire a global movement of emancipation. And we've heard of this general role he played, which inspired all of us. I, however, want to talk about an information product that Walter Lippmann is another of my great heroes. but Walter Wriston. And the fact that I can talk about Walter Wriston and Walter Lippmann's name should come to my tongue is a measure of the tremendous influence as a writer that Walter Wriston commanded. And I think this information product, which sort of epitomizes his insight, is the Twilight of Sovereignty. It might have been called the information standard because that was the key insight that it propounded. But it is, I think, the single greatest book of the last 30 years or so written by any business leader. It's far and away the epitome of prophecy and insight by any representative of any business in America. But it also, this is an era when, today, when Thomas Friedman makes a tremendous impact with his book, The World is Flat. And well, it's all here, folks, and more. The World is Flat had a lot of nice frothy writing in it, and Walter Wriston was not frothy, but The Twilight of Sovereignty is a more profound and interesting book to read today than is The World is Flat. And The Twilight of Sovereignty really expresses in chapter after chapter this insight of how technology, how the microchip essentially, a grain of sand in which whole worlds are inscribed, and the internet, which is fully present in Twilight of Sovereignty, how the grain of sand gets spun out around the globe and fiber optic webs of glass and light, and how satellites transform the globe, projecting technology beyond its Euclidean limits by making all points of the globe essentially equidistant, and dissolving borders and transcending boundaries and eroding all pyramids and power groups and power grids and bureaucracies and structures, and emancipating the people at the bottom. That really is Walter Wriston's great insight. And another major book of today is Alan Greenspan's Age of Turbulence. And apart from its ponderous expositions of very good ideas that Walter Wriston knew in his bones and had already expressed with greater authority and real intimate knowledge in The Twilight of Sovereignty. Walter Wriston was not ponderous, so this is a shorter and easier read than the Age of. But it's there are 1,000 books about the alleged wisdom of Warren Buffett, who is certainly a great investor, but his understanding that America is essentially Squanderville because we have a trade deficit was completely refuted 15 years ago by Walter Wriston in The Twilight of Sovereignty. He showed we don't trade, nations don't trade anymore. Products are not the output of a particular state. They are bundles of value added contributed all around the globe. And to point to this spurious accounting number of the trade gap as somehow indicating an American descent into Squanderville is a complete misconception, as Walter Wriston knew and expounded eloquently in this book. Greenspan makes great plays great stress on the increase of intellectual property as the key asset of American corporations. And of course, Wriston from the beginning asserted decades ago that intellectual property would become increasingly crucial. And indeed today, intellectual property does comprise about a third of all the value market cap of American corporations. So I believe that beyond all these obvious and amazing accomplishments in the world of business and finance that Wriston is known for, I think he will be known increasingly as time passes for this tremendous book he wrote in 1992, which is full of phrases and tropes that are quoted widely everywhere. Perhaps the most famous one is intellectual capital goes where it's welcomed and stays where it's well treated, and multiplies where it's liberated, and withers where it's repressed. These are a whole array of insights about the impossibility of controlling the mercurial insights of human beings. And I believe that the greatest testament to Wriston's influence will be its continuing increase as time passes, and as his essential insight that governments are decreasing in significance in the globe in proportion to the emergence of power outside government boundaries is going to become increasingly manifest. China, for example, myopic people see China as a tyrannous exterminator of human rights, without understanding that this regime has, or during its realm, the share of the Chinese economy actually controlled by government has dropped from 90 to about 20, and it's just a radical force of liberation. But it wouldn't be understood by someone who did not understand the crucial insights of the Twilight of Sovereignty. This book, which represents Wriston's great gift to us today, and we can all go out and read it again, because it deserves a reading today. I just did it on the train down, and all last night, and I've read it several times before, and it lost none of its trenchancy, and I had much time to reflect its relevance to our current political issues in the United States today. I hope that presidential candidates solemnly contemplate it as they proceed through the next year. That hope may not be entirely fulfilled, but its influence does continue. Thank you so much.
The big bets that Walt took in steering Citibank to new markets around the world and also into new technologies were part of his underlying belief that risk was a part of our national heritage. In fact, in the conclusion to one of his books, he warned that, quote, "There is an idea abroad in the land that the descendants of the bold adventurers who founded this country should be sheltered from risk and uncertainty as part of our new national heritage. Yet you will look in vain in the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution for promises of a safe, easy, risk-free life." I have a couple of questions for you, gentlemen, and then we're going to open it up to the to the audience for questions and perhaps reminiscence. There are quite a number of old friends of Walt here, including people who are awfully perceptive in some of these on some of these areas. But the one question, going back to the nature of risk, I think one of the things that we actually have trouble understanding, it's now been more than 20 years since Walt retired, and many of his innovations took place starting 30 and 40 years ago. And it's hard for us to leap into back into those times. For instance, and this is true both internationally but also in the area of technology, it's taken for granted now that we want to not only accept but search for the latest new technology. Everyone is out there. You come out of an MBA school looking for the new thing, the next new thing. That wasn't necessarily the case with technology in the 1960s, the 1970s. In the same way, it wasn't necessarily the case that a global outlook towards expanding your business was well received, expected, accepted. So my first question is, could each of you take us back and talk a little bit about the world in which Walt wrought his innovations? Because I think in some ways they perhaps they were very different from the environment that we look at today, where in retrospect these things seem almost ordinary or expected. Maybe George, you might want to start.
Well, certainly he saw from the very beginning the impact of the personal computer distributing computer power and allowing through the distribution of ATMs and other such devices, essentially ubiquitous banking. Rather than banking and big temples of finance and centralized points, Citibank became a ubiquitous banker, and he I think he was key to John Reed, wasn't he? And the devotion of Citibank to developing its technology to the utmost. Right. And he could see from the impact on his own bank and on his own hierarchy. Banks used to be hierarchical institutions above all, that they were becoming heterarchies as a result of the distribution of computer power. And he projected that insight to the world. And projecting it to the world, he really did gain unique insights that are still valuable today. I don't think there's been any fundamental change, despite the talk of cloud computing and the tremendous re-centralization as it's sometimes imagined to be. But the fact is, each cell phone has 100 times more computer power than the workstations of when Wriston in 1992. So the actual distribution of computer power has been increasing still, despite the apparent formation of these centralized computer data centers that epitomize Serendipity Corporation, or right. Sometimes known as Google.
Right. It strikes me that young people tend to accept new technologies more rapidly, which is one reason why it's sometimes extraordinary for a business executive, a state banking executive, to see the opportunity, because you're actually looking downward to see that opportunity. I remember when I came to New York as a young journalist with my first job in New York City, and I needed to get a checking account, I needed a banking account. Well, I went to the bank that offered ATMs and direct deposit, Citibank, because, my God, I don't have to go in a bank. But I was in my 20s at that point, and to understand that there was someone who, throughout a full banking career, understood what that young, guy in his first job is really more, not only about his technological insight, but also about his sort of ever-present youth, I would say, because that's really one of the things you need to be a technological innovator, I would think. Buzz, maybe you might talk to us a little bit about the international.
I think it's interesting to speculate a little bit. Maybe some of the former colleagues of Walt who are in the room could illuminate this a little bit. But it strikes me that one of the reasons for Walt's great success, and I say only one, was that he was able to steer the bank at a time before deregulation, before globalization. He was able to find those places where the bank could establish a comparative advantage. Because even though we were not living fully in a globalized world, he had a globalized view. And the bank developed very deliberately tremendous expertise on a country-by-country basis and a product basis. These were very skilled people in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think Citibank's success may well have been attributable in some measure to the fact that they were able to operate in what was then a very complicated world. Maybe not as frightening as the world that we have to operate in today in the age of globalization, but nonetheless very complex. And it's true that in my conversations with Walt, and certainly in his life, he demonstrated a willingness to contemplate what technology and science could produce. But he also, I think, did not make the mistake that is perhaps made too frequently today to place unconditioned confidence in technology and science, in the newest financial models, in the newest financial products. There is a paragraph in the latest book, Bits, Bytes, and Balance Sheets, that struck me when I read it a few weeks ago. He said, science, despite all of its advances and the ways in which it is changing the world, does not remake the human mind or alter the power of the human spirit. There is still no substitute for courage and leadership. And that's kind of the way I think about Walt on the basis of my conversations with him. And I think that may be, in fact, his greatest legacy. He didn't resist science and technology, but he didn't accept it unquestioningly. And he never viewed technology as a substitute for judgment. And his judgment was always pretty good.
George, you read or recited from memory impressively that well-known quote of Walt's about capital essentially going where it wants to go. One of the things that Walt did later in life was become an advocate for New York City. He, of course, we're not talking about that today, but he was one of the essential figures in the rescue of New York City, along with Hugh Carey and Felix Rohatyn. And it's interesting, I think that one of the reasons he was so concerned about New York City was not merely because he was a banker and it couldn't pay its bills, but because he saw the vulnerability of New York City in the sort of coming information revolution, and demanded a certain discipline of New York City, which has served the city well since then. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. You mentioned the world is flat. We have a strange situation, really, where on the one hand the world is flat and you can be anywhere, but on the other hand, people still want to be in a place like New York City. Walt still wanted to be in a place like New York City. Understood that there is a power in New York City, even as there's a power in information. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about how those two seemingly disparate things actually come together.
Well, it's freedom. You can choose. These great cities have their tremendous influence across the world, and the direct interplay, face to face, of creative people can dwarf the influence of other territorial forces because of the technology. I mean, one of my great moments, a sort of Wristonian moment, was when I was in China in the late 80s, I believe, and they asked me what would happen in 1997. Now, I was talking about the power of the Hong Kong model, and I said, 1997 is the year Hong Kong takes over China. And it's true. The Hong Kong model completely took over China. And New York City, the revitalization of New York City is the single most inspiring development of my lifetime. I remember when I could not run in Central Park safely. You had to stay to the south end, and even in the north part of the reservoir. And the most amazing experience of my life was in my late 60s, or early 60s actually, but several years ago during the revitalization, when I found myself running with little ladies in tennis shoes around the top of the park. I mean, the recovery of New York City, as you know better than anyone, I guess, is just an amazing, astonishing accomplishment, and to which Wriston was a crucial contributor, and through the Manhattan Institute and through all his leadership downtown and with the city government. So I think it is a major sort of historic achievement of his lifetime is this recovery and triumph of New York City and the creation of the ubiquitous bank.
I think it's time now to open it up to the audience. First of all, either for questions for our distinguished panel, or also for comments or insights from those of you who knew Walt. And I think we have a microphone back there. Donna, you want to write? Yeah, there you go.
I was having lunch yesterday with two of my old partners, Bill Solomon and Henry Kaufman. And Walter's name came up, and he was looked upon as the leader of all leaders, and something we miss today. My relationship with Walter was more on the social side. I used to play tennis with Walter and his good buddy Oscar Dunn from GE, and we were out at John Gardner's when Walter was retiring, and Walter was playing with Oscar and I was playing with Merv Griffin, and I have to say I got worse every day listening to the two of them on the course. Somebody said when I got back, did it improve your game? I said it just kept going downhill every day. But Walter had a great saying about banking, and he said the key to banking were the 3 C's: character, character, character. And he was so right. And the other side of Walter I saw, he had a great heart. Do anything for you. Wonderful man.
Thank you very much. Could you identify yourself to the rest of the audience? A couple of people are asking.
Oh, Dick Schmelk, former Solomon, CAI, private equity after that.
Right. You know, it's so interesting, but in the just one quick comment in the this sort of new world of what's known as behavioral or sometimes evolutionary economics, they try to emphasize the importance that human trust plays in the development of trade. We so often think of all of the restrictions and all the things we have to do to reduce risk and the regulations we have to put in, but as evolutionary economics is now teaching us, it is actually the trust that exists in our ancient society, which is the formation, the foundation for trade. So the notion that it's character, character, character is something that new forms of economics are teaching us is absolutely true. Next question. Or comment? And please identify yourself. Just.
Hi, David Enrich with the Wall Street Journal. Curious what the panelists would think that Mr. Wriston would think about the current financial crisis, and in particular, the problems or issues at Citigroup right now.
Well, perhaps somebody who worked with Walter in banking, but I think he was very skeptical toward the extension of further regulation as a remedy for the problems created by earlier excesses. I think he would be skeptical about the possibility of close control over hedge funds and derivatives and all these creative devices that have emerged and which in general have, as he predicted, reduced the volatility of the global economy and made growth more stable and predictable and diminished the real perils. It's been the power of the information revolution that has produced, I think, a kind of violent reaction against it around the world, which will ultimately give way, but it produces this age of turbulence that we now. But when you really contemplate the numbers, you discover that growth, economic stability, and opportunity is thriving today in this world of serendipity corporation and the ubiquitous bank.
I think he would probably have wanted to remind people that there is a relationship over time, not necessarily in any given instant, but a relationship over time between risk and return, and would suggest that people, perhaps in positions of financial decision-making, should always bear that relationship in mind. In my experience, Walt was not a believer in a free lunch. If you wanted a high return, you were going to have to take a high risk, and in some cases, that would mean that you would fail, or that the proposition would fail. So I think there's no question that he had a lot of confidence in technology, confidence in expanding freedom, and all of that. But he also, in Bits, Bytes, and balance sheets, talks a little bit about the kind of inevitable cycle of excess and then squeezing excess out of markets. And I think that's, in his view, was attributable in some respect, at least, not just to regulation or the mistakes of government, but was also attributable to some of the fundamentals of the human condition.
Yeah, and I always hesitate to speak for someone or imagine what they would think, but I think the answer to that question is actually in his most recent book, in which he was writing about some of the financial problems of the technology meltdown in 2000, 2001. In the opening chapter of the book, he talks about the unintended consequences of Sarbanes-Oxley, and he talks about the unintended consequences in general of regulation. And I think that it sounds like he's talking about now. In the last chapter of the book, he talks about transparency, 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 the need for transparency in the corporate world. And I think that one of the solutions, I think both of those things, if you go and read those chapters, you would think that he's writing about this, what's going on right now. I would also submit that he probably would be horrified at the anti-globalization or the protectionist strain in American politics today. But next question. Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm Rick Wheeler, and I'd just like to start by saying that I came aboard with Citibank. Actually, it wasn't just myself, my wife and I, in 1952, and the rules and regulations of the bank at that time were that while I had been approved, they would not hire me until they met my beloved. And for the rest of our lives, we've never been quite sure just whom the bank hired. I'd like to speak a little bit to the point that you passed over to Steve earlier on about the qualities that Walt brought to us. Starting in 1952, we came into a bank that had a couple of haunting memories. Still, the Depression of 1929, the Pecora Commission that followed in 1933 with that fallout, The second one was the Second World War. Being in the international side of the bank, we had seen our activities sort of pretty much turned upside down in Asia as well as in Europe. Now, the management of those institutions, too, were predominantly pre-war, so it was from literally another period. Walt was truly, and we give credit to George Moore for having shaken things up, but Walt was the person who came in with a vision, and an extraordinary one. The other element that we all learned from, yes, and I can say that, all learned from him is that he was a human being. He was not just out of another time warp, and had a lot of great ideas, and then laid on us, as we've been talking now, the responsibility of risk management, and I think often today how that would have, his presence could have helped us greatly. Risk management, concern in for the community, and the wonderful qualities that you've just mentioned of transparency, openness, and bringing aboard the younger people. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Phil Zweig, former Wall Street Journal, author of a biography of Walter Wriston. I just wanted to mention another point that, in answer to the reporter's question. In Bits and Bytes, I was struck with the comment that Walter made about executive compensation. When I was interviewing Walter for my book, which came out in '96, that wasn't a raging issue. And I was struck with the fact that in this book that Walter was clearly appalled at the obscene executive compensation that we've seen in the last 10 and 15 years, which I think has been a major driver behind the fiasco that we're seeing now.
Thank you. Yes.
What did he say? What was his position on executive compensation? Did he think it should be specified by some government body, or?
No, he, as he states in his book, indicates that felt that boards of directors should be more responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, he has a whole chapter on yeah, absolutely. In his final chapter. Yeah.
Compensation based on real performance. And he railed against these compensation consultants that go around and play one board off against another.
Yeah.
Right.
And that issue just never came up when we were, when I was interviewing Walter for my book. It just wasn't that big of a deal at that point, but it certainly got to be one.
Stanley Goldstein, Goldstein, Kessler. Steve used the phrase eternal youthfulness, and it's more appropriate than you may believe. Walter used to love to find new technologies, try to invest in the companies, and each time something new came along, he got so excited by it, like a 30-year-old guy ready to start a business. And that lasted through his entire life, to his eternal credit.
Yes, actually, I read I forget exactly where I read this. It was in a Time story about Walter, in which I guess it was Fortune magazine asked him in 1999 why did he enjoy spending so much time talking to these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and he said, because I might actually learn something.
One of the first Wriston lecturers was Carver Mead, who was the leading figure at Caltech, and a collaborator with Richard Feynman, and a founder of some 25 companies in Silicon Valley, including one of the key figures in Intel. And he was the man who who did the research behind Moore's Law and named Moore's Law. And Wriston maintained a connection with Carver for years later. I didn't know this, but Carver told me that a few months ago. And Wriston could recognize that he is one of the paramount geniuses in America. I think perhaps the paramount genius is Carver Mead. But, and Wriston saw this. And a lot of people, he's not very well known, Carver Mead, because he's an intellectual, been behind the scenes through most of this history. But Wriston had a rapport with a person like that.
Yes.
I'm a no-bred interloper here, but a friend of Kathy's. 35 years ago, I was sitting in Andelotti's restaurant with Kathy and Walter. They used to come in on Sunday nights, as I did early. And if some of you have been around that long, the real estate market had tanked here in the city. I'd bought 2 apartments in the building which I still am and which the Wristons are. Couldn't sell the first one for 2.5 years, could not get an offer. And I turned to Walter and I said, Walter, what in the hell is happening to our country and to this city? And he turned to me and he said, don't ever underestimate the resiliency of this country. And that was embedded. I've used that quote so many times. Maybe you already have heard it many times, but it was the first and indelible recollection I had of Walter. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Donna, back there. All right. Whatever.
My name is Peter Selden, and I had the experience of being a junior officer at Citibank about 30 years ago, and I had an opportunity to speak to Walter Wriston. I was in San Francisco, in the San Francisco office at the time, and he came by on one of his whirlwind visits. And he said something that has stayed with me for my entire career, and relatively simple. And that was that he said that financial goals do not really motivate people. Earning a 15% return on equity, it does not motivate people. Having a vision, having a passion, wanting to be the best in the world at what you do, that's what motivates people. And I think that is really the spirit with which he led Citibank and Citicorp, a simple idea that has certainly stayed with me throughout my career.
Yes, I think we call that money does not buy happiness. And now all the experts on researchers on happiness around the world are telling us that. We now know for a fact that that's true. Yes.
My name is J.P. Dunn, and I'm with Chief Executive Magazine. Dean, you mentioned Walter Wriston's leadership, and I thought, since this has thus far gone unremarked, I thought I would bring it up, that one of the important principles, actually examples that Walter had, and I knew him best when he had actually left Citibank and he worked with us in various projects, was that he left the bank. He also did not stay on as chairman. He was of the great believer in the principle that once you leave your position as CEO, you should get off and not linger on the board, not linger on as a non-executive chairman. In fact, he admonished people we had at various CEO roundtables who did linger on the board. And his reason goes to George Gilder's point made earlier, that by definition, once you remove yourself from that position, the information with which you are dealing is by definition no longer current. You're no longer in a position to know as much as the person to whom you've passed on the baton, and therefore should get out of the way. That did not sit well with a lot of people. In fact, I remember towards the end of Jack Welch's 20-year career, he was a great champion of Jack, but towards the end, when Welch's bid to take over Honeywell didn't go well, he observed once that he felt, well, I think maybe the time has come when Jack is starting to believe his own press releases. And he gave that example numerous times, and I guess he was an advocate of the Cincinnatus principle. The term imperial CEO had not come into use at that time, but I think it was a great example to other CEOs that when your time is over, that you should step aside and let the next generation take over?
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of City Journal's authors, Professor Arthur Brooks, who's done an enormous amount of social science work, was asked recently, what does your social science research tell you about the key to a long life? And he said, what it shows is that after you retire, make sure you have many more careers. And I think that was true of Walter, and I think that probably his willingness to move on and create himself over and over again had a lot to do with the kind of life that he lived. Well, that's it. It looks like we have no more questions, and we appreciate you all coming. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.